Our next speaker is Xiangyu. Xiangyu Zhong. Xiangyu is a Marxist-Leninist political commentator and a Chinese hip-hop artist based in Taiwan province. And anti-imperialism and class struggle are common themes in his music. So Xiangyu, please have the floor.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking all parties involved in putting together this event, and also everyone attending for taking your valuable time to listen to us speak. It's truly an honor to be included among all of these amazing speakers and friends of the DPRK. My name is Xiangyu, and I like to think of myself as an amateur political commentator. And some of you might know me as a Marxist-Leninist rapper or the guy who shot a pro-DPRK music video in the country with a selfie stick, which I guess is a little bit relevant since I was invited to speak at this event by Carlos, who knows me through my work and is working with me on my next album. Anyways, enough about myself. When I wrote this presentation, I did so with the assumption that the other speakers here will talk about the origins of the Korean conflict, how the imperialists divided Korea and formed a separate regime in South Korea against the will of the Korean people, and other information pertinent to understanding the present situation in Korea. So today I would like to focus my presentation on what it means to support the DPRK's just struggle against imperialism and why it is important. But before I begin, I'd like to recommend a few very basic books to those interested that I believe will help people better understand the Korean War, the ongoing Korean conflict, as well as get a glimpse of what life is like in North Korea. They are namely The Korean War 1945 to 1953 by Hugh Dean, A Capitalist in North Korea by Felix Zapt, and two books by Bruce Cummings, The Korean War, A History, and North Korea, Another Country. Of these four books and three authors, only Hugh Dean is a communist. So for those who care, these books are by no means propaganda from Pyongyang. And a book I recommend for understanding the basics of imperialism are Rogue State by William Bloom, Against Empire by Michael Perenni, and Black Shirts and Reds by the same author. Another thing is, if everything goes as planned, I will be moving to Beijing and going to the DPRK often for work. So if you're interested, you can follow me on social media to see some of what I'll be seeing if and when it happens. So one of the first things I want to address is this. It's no secret that Western media often runs very sensational stories about North Korea grounded in zero facts whatsoever, such as claiming that Hyun Sung-woo had been executed only for her to miraculously come back to life later, or women claiming that everyone is required to get Marshal Kim Jong-un's haircut, then claiming that nobody but Kim Jong-un is allowed to have that haircut. The imperialists are determined to portray North Korea as some sort of living hell because the Workers' Party of Korea has the audacity to do the unthinkable, which is to refuse to kowtow to Washington and to lead the country on terms set by the Korean people. On the flip side, though, and I don't think this is addressed enough by those of us who are pro-DPRK, is the fact that there are some people who try too hard to do the exact opposite, which is to paint North Korea as some sort of workers' paradise without any problems, and that the people there are basking in all sorts of individual freedoms unknown to much of the rest of the world. This lack of context and nuance, in my personal opinion, does not help our anti-imperialist cause or the DPRK at all. After all, how can a country that is clearly impacted by some of the most brutal economic and political sanctions known to human history be heaven on earth when those sanctions have been effective in crippling the economy? I recommend Felix Zapt's book, A Capitalist in North Korea, because his book explains pretty well how sanctions work from the perspective of someone who's lived in North Korea for, I believe, 7 years and dealt firsthand with those sanctions as he tried to conduct his business. To put things simply, I want you to imagine two people from two families. One grew up in an affluent family while the other grew up in poverty. All else equal, I want you to think, which person objectively has more freedom? Think about the rich kid. When he grows up, he can choose whether or not he wants to go to college or take a backpacking trip around the world to find himself or whatever. Or he can try to start a business and then become even more affluent if successful, or fail and then decide to go to grad school and then work for Jeff Bezos or whatever. Basically, his choices are underachieving his way through life, through a comfortable life, or put in some effort and live an extremely comfortable life, at least from a material standpoint. Now, the poor kid, think about his options. He might be forced by circumstance to forego college and work some difficult, low-paying job in order to support his family, whether it be his parents, siblings, or children, whatever. And keeping a family together and functional under those conditions takes a lot of discipline and sacrifice, but it also makes people really resilient at the same time if successful. And so if we zoom out onto a more macro level, we'll find that concepts like universal freedoms didn't exist in much of humanity until a certain level of economic development. In more primitive societies of the past, with less developed modes of production, society could not afford to just let everyone do whatever they want and not work. Without a certain level of discipline, the entire society will fail to produce food and sustain itself and crumble as a result. And this is even if there aren't hostile forces surrounding it. Now, I'm not saying that the DPRK today is such a society, nor am I saying that the DPRK does not have rule of law and is some sort of Orwellian hell. But it is true that for a society that is under siege by hostile forces to survive, that the discipline of the masses is very crucial. And I want to put this into perspective so we can understand why certain phenomena exist in the DPRK. Because aside from blatant lies about North Korea, like the word love not existing, a lot of anti-DPRK propaganda works by pointing out and exaggerating things that can be observed and divorcing them completely from their context. One example would be the internet not being available to most people in the DPRK. For most people in America, this is an unimaginable disregard for personal freedom, while many in the developing world also lack internet access, not necessarily because they're not allowed to have it, but because they don't have the infrastructure. So to someone in a very poor country who does not have internet, is it that ridiculous for the people in North Korea to not have it? This is one thing to think about. Another is that it is undeniable that imperialists have a history of attempting to destabilize and overthrow governments that refuse to be subservient to them using tools like mass media and the internet. We've seen this attempted in Cuba very recently. And one of the most active organizations involved in the destabilization campaign against Cuba was the National Endowment for Democracy, or the NED, which funds and trains selected political organizations, movements, and media all over the world to advance US interests. The NED has even openly admitted to meddling in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region since early 2000s. In fact, the World Uyghur Congress is almost entirely funded by the NED. Celebrity defector Pagyami works for a right-wing think tank, the Atlas Network, which is funded in part by the NED, in addition to, ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, as well as other companies and organizations. So if we look at the NED's record of undermining the sovereignty of other countries and think about how our understanding of countries unwilling to submit to the imperialist will of Washington are shaped by our media, then even if we disagree with North Korea limiting internet access to its citizens, we can at least understand where they're coming from. And even if we disagree with certain policies of the DPRK, such as this one, it is important to understand that as foreigners, especially people living in the US, that the only relevant position for us to hold if we truly care about the well-being of the Korean people in North Korea is to stand opposed to the US's hostile policies against the DPRK. And this holds true even if you do believe the worst things said about the DPRK by the media. I know some might ask why it's okay for the DPRK to go to these extremes to defend their sovereignty, while the US allows us to go on whatever website we want and organize events such as the one we're attending right now. And this is a very valid question. However, we cannot deny that when more than half of the world's media are owned by US corporations, the US's strength in propaganda is disproportionately more powerful than those of countries like Korea and Cuba. One is on the offense, while the other is on the defense. And when a country lacks soft power, it's forced to defend itself with hard measures. This is very important to consider when economic sanctions are designed to cause dissatisfaction among the people with the hope that they'll shift the blame onto their government. If we think about people suffering from sanctions as fuel, then regime change propaganda disseminated into the target country by imperialists is like a flame. And we should not forget how quickly freedoms can disappear in America when people organize in a serious way. In 1950, the Internal Security Act was passed, and in it was an emergency detention provision that gave power to the US government to throw suspected communists into concentration camps should an emergency situation be declared. This was back when the Communist Party of the USA had been a formidable force in the United States for a few decades, and when the international communist movement was strengthening on the international stage. If you want to learn more about this history, I highly recommend checking out a book by Harry Haywood titled Black Bolshevik. Back then, organized labor in the US was still able to effectively wring concessions from the ruling class, though it was also around this time that years of right opportunism in the CPUSA began to really erode the party from within. The emergency detention provision would not be repealed until 1971. And also, think about how closely the FBI monitored the activities of organizations like the Black Panthers or the Young Lords, and dismantled these organizations with scant regard for the rule of law or the niceties of so-called liberal democracy. Fred Hampton was savagely murdered by the state, and Assata Shakur, to this day, remains in exile as a political refugee in Cuba. Today, we can freely talk about communism online. To be perfectly honest, because the state of the organized left in the US is very weak and does not pose a threat to the US any longer. But if one day there is a mass communist movement that is disciplined and organized, you can bet that the state will take away our freedom to be open communists. Whether our state is run by, whereas our state is run by monopoly capitalists, also known as the imperialists, to protect their interests that run counter to the interests of the vast majority of the people around the world, the DPRK is run by revolutionaries who fought for the national liberation of the Korean people against the Japanese and American invaders, who are doing their best to protect it. And these people are doing the best to protect the interests of the broad masses of the Korean people. And they're regrettably forced by circumstance to run their half of the country with levels of discipline unimaginable to us simply to survive. If we want to see the Korean people enjoy more relaxed lives, then we should call for the imperialists to seize their economic, political, and military aggression against Korea. When we as foreigners fail to view US imperialism as a primary contradiction in this situation, and instead focus our energy on denouncing the DPRK, we are in reality justifying further aggression against Korea and hence supporting a US-led regime change operation. Unfortunately, this view is nearly universally dismissed by the entire political spectrum in the West, even among many self-described socialists, communists, and anti-imperialists. I've seen self-described leftists call for the assassination of Marshal Kim Jong-un in order to save the North Koreans. But even if every lie told about the DPRK and Kim Jong-un were true, and they're not, but let's just assume for the sake of argument, we need to ask ourselves this very important question. When and where has US-sponsored regime change ever resulted in more freedom and democracy for the people of the targeted country? Did Iranians become more free after Mossadegh was overthrown? Did Chileans live better lives after Allende was ousted and Pinochet was installed? Let's look at Libya. It used to be a country where people of neighboring countries went for opportunities back when Gaddafi was around. After his murder by the US, people are running away from it in hopes of finding better lives. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the US has overthrown countless governments, many of which were democratically elected, in order to protect its hegemony. Some of these countries include, but are not limited to, Iran, Guatemala, Iraq, Cambodia, Libya, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia, and Haiti. Furthermore, can we even make the argument that North Korea is the aggressor in its relationship with the US? People often point to the fact that the DPRK withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty back in 2003 as proof that they're warmongering terrorists. What's often forgotten is that the UN Security Council Resolution 984 acknowledges pledges by the 5 nuclear weapon states to not use or threaten to use nukes against non-nuclear parties of the NPT. And while Bush invaded Afghanistan and was preparing to push for war in Iraq, the US was also running simulations on carrying out preemptive nuclear strikes against North Korea, which I think we can all agree is tantamount to a threat, and that the DPRK was justified in pursuing a nuclear deterrent. So the problems of countries like the DPRK that are targets of US imperialist aggression, whether they're real or imagined, cannot be used as justification for us to withhold our international solidarity. I think a recurring thing in what I've said today is that problems like limited freedom of expression in countries on those of the receiving end of imperialist aggression are often exacerbated, if not caused by the imperialist aggression itself. If we truly care about the people in North Korea and we genuinely want them to thrive, then we must do our part to stand up against the military aggression, economic sabotage, and political isolation carried out right here in the United States. All other positions, including drawing false equivalencies, like saying Kim Jong-un and Biden are both bad, so we should support neither, or the liberal savior advocating of intervention or color revolution, are simply expressions of imperialist chauvinism that leave the door wide open for further imperialist aggression. Thank you all very much for your time.